Stanford University.
So what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about what really is a buzzword that probably gets used so much that it kind of becomes meaningless, to see if we can get to a point where we actually take these terms, killer app, smart grid, and put some definition around it so that you walk out of here with a more concrete thought as to some of the real opportunities available now in smart grid development and applications on top of the smart grid that I believe have a real potential to save money for end-use consumers and to make our electricity consumption infrastructure much more efficient. So just by way of background, I was an undergraduate here, actually under Gil, and with all due respect to the environmental engineers in the room, Gil saved me from a career of designing sewers and steered me into energy efficiency instead, where I have been, for all intents and purposes, ever since. And have been with this company, EnerNOC, for the past 3 years, as Lee mentioned, doing business development, which can mean a lot of different things, but has essentially meant building out our West Coast business. We're a Boston-based company, 6 years old, and have been, as I say, helping to get things going on the West for the last few years. So I read this last night and thought it was actually appropriate for this discussion, despite the perhaps misconnect between starting a conversation like this with a little bit of poetry. The reason I felt like this was important is what we're talking about today with respect to smart grid development, smart grid infrastructure. There's certainly a lot of hype and talk about it right now, but it's been building for a long time. This really, the concepts aren't new. A lot of people will hear what I'm saying today and say, yeah, we were talking about this 20 years ago, or the future developments that we're talking about we're maybe doing in some form right now. If you walk out of this room with nothing else, I want you to walk out thinking, this is now, this is happening. You can walk out today and participate in this and help to make these changes that are just in their nascent stages right now, help to make them happen. Time present, time past are both perhaps present in time future. And time future is contained in time past. So I admit it, smart grid is a buzzword. And as I was thinking about this morning, it occurred to me, well, just how much of a buzzword is this? And I found that, as many of you probably know, Google allows you to go and see how often people are searching for these terms. The chart on your left-hand side there is the usage index for the term smart grid over the last couple of years, last year. Essentially what that's saying is, since the first of the year, it's been used about 10 times the average, and prior to 2008, it's been used about 100 times prior to how often it was used during 2007 and earlier. It's just seen this huge spike. A lot of people have been typing this into Google to find out what's going on. I found 2.7 million sites that came up when I typed the term smart grid into Google, almost 2,500 news stories. It's just something that's on people's minds. Killer apps also is something that gets a lot of attention, although oddly spiky. I'm not quite sure what the data is showing us there. I'd like to think that spike there has to do with this talk and the announcement of this talk. Everybody going in and typing in what's going on. It's obviously not just smart grid interest. This is a term that has people use in a lot of different applications, and we'll get into a little bit more detail. So, what does a smart grid mean? You may have seen GE ads with the scarecrow singing "If I Only Had a Brain," and maybe you've heard other discussions about smart grid. And I suspect that it means something different to, if I randomly ask 3 of you, which I won't be cold calling until a little bit later, you'll probably get 3 different definitions. A lot of people think of it as smart meters. Is it a smart meter? Is that what constitutes the smart grid? And I think that's part of it. I think that is an element of the smart grid. Oh, great. Going to sleep. I took sleep and dreams when I was here, and when somebody fell asleep, you had to point at the person, and everybody went quiet until that person woke up. So if anybody falls asleep, the person next to them point at them, and I'll stop talking until that person wakes up. And we have to ask them what they're dreaming about. Smart grid. So certainly it's meters. There's also the distribution system, the transmission system. There's generation, sort of traditional generation, as well as new renewable generation. On-site generation, whether, again, it's renewable or the more traditional types of on-site generation. Storage, all sorts of different end uses, whether you're in an industrial environment, residential, commercial. And overlaying all of this, a network that allows each of these elements of this grid to speak to one another. To me, that's what the smart grid is. It is the combination of all of these things. It's not any single aspect of those, or to focus on any single aspect of that, I think you miss part of the picture. Another thing, I think there is a lot of attention, I've seen a lot of interest around residential smart grid activities, taking the meters, particularly where we live, given that there is a smart grid meter rollout going on around us as we speak. There's a lot of attention paid to residential smart grid applications. And I think there's a lot of interesting work going on. I don't focus very much on that, so I'm not going to talk very much about it. But I guess I'd also point out here that while the number of customers in the residential sector far outweighs the number of customers in the other two sectors, it's actually pretty evenly split in terms of the amount of kWh consumption between the three. Another way of saying that is you've got to reach way more customers in order to implement energy savings opportunities to get at this billion or so kilowatt hours per year if you're going through the residential route, far fewer if you go to commercial customers or industrial customers. So from my perspective, and as trying to develop a business for a relatively new company, we've got to focus where the opportunity is today, where we can deploy today, where we can get out and touch customers, get them starting to save today, and that's why we focused where we have. Killer apps. So this is another, as I said, this is a buzzword. What does it really mean? And why is it important? Why do you really care about a killer app? Why don't you just focus on that infrastructure itself and the meters and the monitoring devices and the end-use appliances? If you think about the internet, it's kind of interesting to be able to have a bunch of computers that talk to one another. You can share each other's files, and you can see what's going on the other computer. But it didn't really take off until you were able to use a browser to actually browse the websites and the information that somebody might post up for you. Took another big increase in activity when email came on the scene, and people were now able to send messages to one another or not just that they were able to, but the fact that everybody had an email account meant that there was a sort of network effect of being able to get messages wherever you wanted to send them. And pretty soon, Google came along, and you could use the web now not just to communicate with one another and to go to a site that you knew had some information you wanted, but to find something that's buried in the needle in the haystack out there that might be the information you're looking for. Of course, everybody's familiar with Facebook and the San Francisco mayor's announcement of his gubernatorial aspirations yesterday at Facebook, I think sort of underscore the importance of social networking as a new killer application for the web right now, driving people to connect with one another directly and en masse. I really have no idea what Twitter is, but everybody seems to be talking about it, and I'm sure it's really important, and hopefully somebody out there can tell me why it's important to this business. I'm not sure, but I'm sure you'll tell me. And of course, the iPhones and the App Store, this kind of epitomizes the importance of maybe not just a killer app, but a series of applications that make the device, the iPhone, elevate it beyond the status of a telephone and an email device, but actually make it something that people really rely on, whether it's in their day-to-day life or for running their business. They've got a whole series of business-focused applications now. So I'm sure we could spend hours crafting the definition of smart grid killer applications, but this was the quick shot at it that I took. Smart grid killer applications are services and products that first provide value to business and consumers. I think it's important that they do both. Often providing value to consumers actually ends up providing value to businesses, in the Google example, for example, are enabled by smart grid monitoring and data infrastructures. So it's important that it's providing value to people, but Google is not a smart grid killer application. It doesn't necessarily deliver data services over the smart grid, at least not right now. And in turn, the fact that these applications or these products and services deliver this value over the infrastructure, the smart grid monitoring and data infrastructures, in turn drives rapid development of those infrastructure, the elements of that infrastructure. So that's what I'm thinking about for the remainder of the talk, which will focus on two specific, what I consider to be smart grid killer applications that we have available to us now and are driving the development of this. So the first one I wanted to talk about is demand response. This is the core business for my company, for EnerNOC, and it is essentially managed. This is our network operations center, the NOC in EnerNOC, through which we manage 2,500 megawatts of demand response capacity across 4,000 customer sites in the US and Canada. So we'll announce our quarterly results in a couple of weeks, and at that point, we expect to be able to announce that if we were a power plant, we would be the 10th biggest power plant in the US. This is a real resource that is delivering real value to grid operators today. To help you to understand exactly what that means, what demand response is, and why it's important, I wanted to show you this graph. This is what's called a load duration curve. So if you think about the load profile for a building or a group of buildings or a city or a country, over the course of a day and a week and a month, you'll see variations. It'll be low in the night, and it'll start to pick up a little bit in the morning, peak in the afternoon, and drop off in the evening. That'll be higher in the summertime than it is in the winter, typically. And you'll have sort of up and down variation throughout the course of the year. Well, if you reordered all those data points so that rather than being ordered sequentially, you're actually ordering them in terms of the demand on those days, what you would find is the top 10% of the kilowatt hours consumed throughout the course of the year, the top 10% of demand, occurs during only 1% of the hours out of the year. Another way of saying that is if there were 10 power plants powering the entire country, one of those power plants would be shut off 99% of the hours out of the year, almost 8,700 hours, almost 8,700 hours out of the year. It'd be sitting idle. Not surprisingly, the power generated by that plant is pretty darn expensive because you still had to build it, you still have to build all the infrastructure around it, but you only get to use it 1% of the hours out of the year. So that's really expensive power. That's about a $3 billion investment in capital expenditures on the plants and the infrastructure to support those plants each year. That's a lot of money going in just to support 1% of the hours out of the year. So with demand response, the utility can go to end-use customers and have them reduce demand targeted around those peak days when you're at the high end of that spectrum there, and have them reduce demand so that you actually don't have to have that last power plant available to turn on. This means you don't have to invest this money to be able to meet that last little spike in the demand, and you get to save a lot of money on the grid. The customers who participate get paid to do so, and of course the overall operating costs of providing power to customers goes down. Okay, so that's the value that it's delivering. I said you have to provide value. You've got to leverage the smart grid infrastructure. This is the leverage the smart grid infrastructure part. So when you're using real-time monitoring and control of end-use facilities, you've got the ability to see what's happening in real time. That makes it look like a power plant to a utility or a grid operator. It's not just, I know I've got a lot of people who will see a Flex Your Power ad and start turning things off, which is helpful, but it's actually, no, I'm watching in real time, and I know that this set of customers was consuming X, and now they're consuming 90% of X, or whatever it is. Technology-based, meaning we can actually remotely control in some cases. We can certainly use existing controls to help make facilitate a customer's demand response activities. So this could be integrating into a building management system, and the lights that dimmed there at the beginning, that's a very typical demand response measure that you can control remotely. System level monitoring, so it's important to be able to know what's going on at nodes within the system so that you've got a sense for where you've got constraints that need to be met. In some cases, actually sub-metering. So maybe you've got a huge campus all on one meter with the utility, and you've got a lot of variable loads that are moving up and down. Maybe you're going between, I don't know, 20 and 22 megawatts in the course of a given day, just with motors cycling off and on and sort of random variation. What you really wanted to be able to do is sub-meter into a specific device that you know you're going to turn off and be able to measure that that device has gone off, even though there's variation, normal random variation in the rest of the campus. And we'll talk a little bit about the energy efficiency aspect of this in a minute. We're just getting to the point where you've got two-way energy data so that the meter itself is communicating this information back in real time to the utility, and dynamic pricing, therefore, so that you can actually give customers a price signal. Instead of saying, we're going to charge you 11 cents every afternoon in the summer, we're going to actually give the customer a price signal to say, your price is variable depending on demand and supply. So from our experience as well, it works best when customers don't have to make on-the-spot decisions. If you've got, sending the price signal is good. It gives some information to the customer that they don't have before, but helping them to know in advance what to do with that information is really the key for us. They need to, so when a demand response event happens, we notify them. We let them know, whether that's phone, email, page, lights flashing in a control room, whatever it might be. Curtailing, ideally we like to control the loads ourselves from our network operations center, so that in the grocery store example, this is a perfect example. The store manager gets a note on their phone. 5 minutes later, they see every other light go off. We've controlled remotely, and they feel the temperatures start to drift up 4 degrees. We do that across a chain of 100 grocery stores, and that's a good 4 or 5 megawatts of demand response potential. The real-time monitoring goes back to the grid. They get to see that this is happening. They know it's happening as it is happening. They get to see the drop and know that they don't have to go out and procure power to meet that spike in demand. And then at the end of the event, customers like to know how they did. They're not doing this just out of the goodness of their hearts. They want to understand, as active participants in grid balancing, what they did. And so we provide that background information for them. So I did say I would cold call, and maybe I won't cold call, but at least look for volunteers to help. This is what we do every day for customers. I've got, on the next 3 slides, demand response charts for 3 different types of customers. And I'll tell you what they are alphabetically, so it doesn't tell you what order they're in. Cold storage, facilities that either store ice or food products typically. Food processing, so this is like a canning facility. And then the third is rock crushing. So in each of these facilities, these are customer types that we work with all the time to help them participate in demand response. They get notified, they reduce load at their facility, and then they turn it back on when the event is over. So this particular event, some things to point out, it's a pretty large facility. 2.5 megawatts is a large commercial industrial site. After the notification, they've got sort of a step function reduction in how their power is consumed. They did have a little bit of a spike back in the early part of the event, but held it off at a very low level for the entire event, well below their commitment. Of those 3 types of facilities, cold storage, food processing, rock crushing, anybody hazard a guess as to what kind of customer might exhibit this sort of a load profile in a demand response event? It's 1 in 3 chance.
Cold storage.
Why do you think cold storage?
It was hot in the noon, and they had to cool it, and then it got even hotter in the afternoon, so they had to cool it a bit more, and they kept them fine until the end of the evening.
That logic is perfect, but it's wrong. But it is perfect. Many cold storage facilities, if they know that there's going to be a critical period in the afternoon, they can pre-cool so that they have a little bit extra, they can essentially coast through an event a little bit. It tends not to be as much of a step function as you see here, and it also tends not to go almost all the way down to zero. So who's going to take the 50-50 shot?
Rock crushing.
Rock crushing it is. They've got a crusher that they turn off up here, but the rock that they've crushed is still going down the line that they've turned off here once that line is cleared out, and then getting sorted, and once the sorter is cleared out, they turn that off. This particular facility realized that they had not actually gotten everything out of the sorter that they needed to, and it's actually a pretty big spike when they turned the power back on. But that's right. So all sorts of rock crushers are participating in this. Another point to make here is, yeah, we are talking about Fortune 500s, but not exclusively. There's a lot of little mom and pop-ish kind of businesses that can participate in this.
So do they just shut down the line and everybody goes home?
Yeah, so interestingly, rock crushing is such an energy-intensive business and such a low-margin business that the payment we provide them for this service actually exceeds their profit that they would have made during that period. It's not always true, but in this particular industry it is.
What is the committed capacity? Is that what's allowed to use?
Great question. The committed capacity here is we enter into an arrangement with the customer in advance so that they know what is going to be expected of them when the demand response event happens, and that represents their committed capacity. This particular customer said, look, I'm not quite sure that I'm going to be able to do this on any given day. I know I can at least get my crusher turned off. Sometimes it takes me a while to get my line cleared out, my sorter cleared out, as you see down here. So I'm going to be conservative, and this is what I'll commit to, and this is what you'll pay me based on. And they well overperformed.
How is their compensation for that additional performance?
So that varies by market. Some markets you get paid for the full overperformance. Some it's capped. Some you get a portion of it. Most markets you get paid for something close to what you commit to do.
Do they commit to buying a certain amount of power after this period is ended?
They do not. So there are some utilities who are a little bit concerned that this will represent a net loss in sales. In this particular case, a rock crusher, that rock's going to get crushed sometimes. Sometimes it's just not crushed during that window.
What's the difference between capacity payments that they get versus an actual operational savings?
So I don't know for this specific customer, but for about a megawatt of commitment, that's typically anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000 per year. So then they're probably called upon to do this anywhere from 3 to 6 times a year. So call that about $10,000 per interruption. That is what they got paid essentially for this interruption. And for this particular customer, that exceeded their profit margin on the rocks they were going to crush during that period.
Do you get real-time data here at your control center, and if so, how?
Sure, sorry. Do we get real-time data at the control center, at the network operations center, and if so, how? Right now, we take a pulse off the utility meter, and we feed it over the customer's LAN back to our network operations center. With the smart meter rollout, we'll be able to get that data directly off the meter or rather, either without having to install the pulse output, which will be one nice improvement, or through a central, there's some of the networks that have been proposed will provide a central depository of data, and we can go to one source to get the data, which will be a big cost savings for us. All right. So we're down to 50-50. Here's another one, similar load profile in terms of the amount of consumption, around 2.5 megawatts. Blue is what they actually used. Red is this is a different program where you're actually calculating, looking back over the last 2 weeks and averaging out what their consumption was to say what their baseline is. And then their yellow is what they were committed to perform. Yeah, 50-50. Cold storage it is, yes. I usually bring little, like squeeze toys or something like that. I didn't bring them. You can see my office about them. I'll be happy. So a lot of ice manufacturers, a lot of food storage. You do see a little bit of a bump up here. This was actually a relatively short notification window for this particular program. They dropped well below where they needed to, but via the real-time monitoring, saw that they could actually start to turn some of their compressors back on and still maintain their commitment, and they did so. You also see a pretty big jump up. As soon as the event's over, these guys are getting their product cold again. They don't waste any time, and they actually have a pretty big, a lot of people call that sort of a additional consumption after the event is over. Didn't think about this, that it would be pretty obvious what number 3 was by the time we got to it. Yes? Well done. Well done. Are you getting graded for this, for the class? No, shoot. Food processing. The only point I'll make here is this particular customer actually didn't meet their commitment. You'll recall the first customer did. Part of what we can do is look across our whole portfolio of customers at a time and say, are we delivering the 50 megawatts or whatever it is to the utility that we committed to deliver? And if we're not, where are there customers who are underperforming that we can?
Forgive me if I get this wrong, but your business model is to actually pay people during that peak period to reduce their demand?
Yeah, let me expand on that a little bit. Our source of revenues is the utilities. The utility pays us as if we were a peaking power plant providing, say, 100 megawatts of demand response potential. We use that money to find the customers, enable them with monitoring and controls, identify the demand response curtailment activities that they will undertake, and we pay them for their participation.
Those last 2 examples were around a couple of megawatts. This one's, their response is about a third of a megawatt. What's the minimum size for your model?
It's a great question. For our model, it gets down about 100 kilowatts. So that's a medium-sized business. Of response. Below that level, our investment in monitoring the site doesn't pay off. So that's another way that a smart grid infrastructure that gets improved, and thereby facilitating data acquisition, would help us to get more customers.
What is the penalty for non-compliance?
Varies.
Contracted to and then for you with the utility?
Yeah, varies dramatically by region. Our approach to the penalties to the customer is they are essentially their maximum exposure is that they don't get paid. They'll never be in a position of having to pay us. But our exposure to the utilities is a penalty that we'd actually have to pay for underperformance. Our total average performance against our commitment is 101% of the commitments on average that we've delivered. In relative terms, a peaking power plant typically delivers 98%. That's kind of binary. It's either on or it's off, and if you don't have one show up, that's a big chunk that doesn't deliver. And in most cases, we can at least deliver something. So I know we've got not a whole lot of time left. This just essentially takes all of those individual reductions, aggregates them together, and flips it over so that instead of looking like a big drop in consumption, which is what it is, from a utilities perspective, looks like a peaking power plant turned on. It's a 30-minute ramp-up window, which is not so uncommon for certain types of power plants. This one delivered over 100 megawatts. That's peaking power plants can be as small as 10, 20 megawatts. So this is a real resource that the utility looks at and says, all right, I can count on this. It's reliable. I see it in real time. It looks to me like a power plant. I don't have to have a power plant constantly spinning in reserve to meet this kind of spike in demand. So when I talk about demand response events, the question is, what kind of events am I talking about? It's typically the hot summer days in the afternoon. That's the typical profile for a demand response event is 2 to 5 p.m. on a hot Thursday and a heat wave. We got called yesterday down in San Diego. They were spiking up to about 100.
What do you get paid per kilowatt hour? Is it like MPR, or do they have a special rate, or is it the spot price?
So it varies again by market. It tends to be something closer to the spot price.
What keeps the utilities from doing this, what you're doing, besides not being as smart as you?
What keeps the utilities from doing this? Nothing. The answer is they do. You can, as a customer, go directly to your utility, and for most customers, and participate directly with the utility. And many customers do. So the reason that we exist is, first and foremost, what we get to say to a customer that a utility typically in most parts of the country cannot is, we have a financial interest in maximizing the amount of your reduction. The utility, in most cases, doesn't have that same kind of direct financial commitment. They certainly don't have 100% or 90% of their business devoted to creating this industry, where our interests are aligned much more closely. In the back?
Do you charge up front for the monitoring equipment that you install?
We do not, and that's a very key part of this model. Is that the question is, do we charge up front? We believe that for a customer to participate in demand response, it's kind of an odd concept. There are enough hurdles for them to get over without also having to write us a check, so we don't have them write a check, which is good. I'm going to jump in as a segue into the next section here on our monitoring-based building commissioning. Because it turns out once we, EnerNOC, or another aggregator or somebody has installed that monitoring equipment, there's actually a lot of other neat things you can do with that monitoring infrastructure that's in place. So if we install a $3,000 box and associated hardware to get main meter level data back to the customer, that's the basis for taking that same box and feeding in inputs from a building management system, the control system that tells the air conditioning unit to turn off and on, and tells the vents to open and close, and in some cases tells the lights to turn off and on. It's the brains of the building.
Do your customers get the real-time feedback too, or is it going just to you guys only?
Customers get the real-time feedback too. That's a key part of this. A lot of people do it just for that real-time data. So if you're the owner of a building, you buy the building, you start it in operation. You typically commission it when you buy it, meaning when we finish building it, meaning you go through and test all the systems, make sure they're working. But it's like anything; it gets out of tune over time. And if you're a building owner, you typically see there's some periodicity to how you're consuming energy, and it's going up and down. Maybe that, depending on what the time frame is, that could be day and night or seasonally. And eventually you get to a point where you say, you know what, I know this building's not working how it should. You bring in a commissioning agent to spend a couple weeks going through, taking measurements, and giving you a tune-up on the building. And you get some savings. And then you continue to go back up over time as things get out of tune again, and you do it again. Monitoring-based building commissioning is a means of capturing some portion of those savings, not necessarily going to capture every savings opportunity that you will find when you are monitoring, when you come in and spend a lot of man hours to find the savings opportunities. But you're doing it while the problems are happening. So instead of saying, hey, you know what, for the last year, those vents haven't been working properly, you've lost a lot of money there, can come back in closer to real time and say, hey, this is a problem, you should fix it today, because if you wait a year, you're going to waste this much money. And so that's the monitoring-based approach, taking that information as it comes in, providing it as a feedback to the building operator and saying, hey, you've got a problem to fix.
You might be talking about some future there, but besides vents, what are examples of ways that you can rapidly tune buildings?
So I am. Let me jump to that in a second. There are a couple of good examples on that. First, just to walk you through how this works, you've got your end-use devices, whether they're energy-consuming pieces of equipment or actually on-site generation, whatever it is on-site at your facility related to energy that you want to monitor. We've got a monitoring infrastructure. This is our imaginatively named EnerNOC site server. It's off-the-shelf components that we use to gather the data from the building management system. The building management system itself is an important question somebody asked, as I was talking about earlier, is, can we do this in the 10,000 square foot office building, down the street in Menlo Park? Not yet. Based on our approach right now is to go after the building stock that's 100, 200,000 square foot buildings where you have this building management infrastructure in place. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in that sector to be addressed before you push down, and our hope and expectation, and maybe some of you in this room are actually pushing this direction, is that the monitoring infrastructure will be in place as we pluck the low-hanging fruit from the buildings where it exists now. I always wonder where we get these graphics. I don't know why that's a TCP/IP graphic, but it is apparently. Send the data back right now over the existing network, internet network. You can just as easily, if there's an alternate network built out for metering data, send it over that. And it comes back to some central source, in our case, our PowerTrack platform, where we analyze the data and provide the updates to the customer on what's going wrong. So you'd asked a question about some of the examples of the issues we find. And I will admit, I had to make a phone call a few hours ago to find out exactly what VAV hunting is. I knew what the concept was, but I didn't know why it's called hunting, and thought I might get that question. VAV hunting. The variable air volume boxes are boxes in most of the rooms in a big building that control the volume of air that's being pushed into a room as a means of primarily adjusting the temperature in the room. So these variable air volume boxes have little sensors on them, and temperature sensors and airflow sensors, and have little actuators to move the vents open and shut. And essentially what they're doing is they're trying to get the temperature of the air in the room right. So it turns out there's a fairly common malfunction in these boxes whereby they are hunting for that right temperature. They're out of calibration, and they'll put a bunch of air in the room. They'll start putting a bunch of air in the room because they think it's too warm, and then the temperature gauge will tell them, you solved the problem, and it'll close the vent, and then it'll tell them, sorry, it's too hot again. You got to do it. You got to make that adjustment again, and you see this rapid open close, open close, open close. Net effect is you're actually pumping a lot more air in that room than you need to keep the temperature where you want it to be. You find that problem, and it stops doing it. It maintains an open status as long as it needs to in order to get the room where it needs to be, and then it comes off. So there's this particular savings. They don't have to spend anything to fix this, really. They're going back in and they're adjusting the calibration on the sensors. So just to do a case study, our first customer in this arena was West Connecticut State University. We now do it for a number of facilities, including the CSU system in California. For this particular customer, they were seeing a spike in energy prices a couple of years ago, pretty significant, and their budgets were going through the roof. They've got 2 campuses with 25 buildings, 283,000 square feet. This is a pretty good-sized facility. They didn't really have anything that was telling them what was going on aside from the main meter level. So you don't really, when you're looking at the main meter, it doesn't tell you anything about which pieces of equipment might be malfunctioning. Couldn't really do the comparisons. They had no idea whether they were doing better or worse than the year before. They just didn't know. So, and what is also common is facility staffs are lean and getting leaner and being asked to do more with less, and they essentially they've got such a long list of things to do, they don't really have a way to prioritize their activities often. So this is an ideal candidate for us. So in this particular customer, we found over $275,000 in annualized energy savings. This is almost entirely through air handling unit, this particular campus, through adjustments to their air handling unit. So it's schedules that are being overridden. It's, again, temperature sensors that are out of calibration. It's the little things that you don't really think about. It's like your dad telling you when you're a kid, turn the lights off. Those actually do add up on a 300,000 square foot campus. So I do want to leave more time for questions. So I'm going to jump to the last slide, which is just some food for thought. Where do we go from here? What are the next waves of smart grid applications that will drive the development of the grid itself? A lot of these things don't necessarily even have anything directly to do with energy, or the primary value isn't necessarily saving energy. Submetering of tenants, a commercial land property owner right now can't necessarily even, in most cases, bill a customer for a tenant for their energy use. They simply divide it out by the number of square feet they have in the building. Monitoring based commissioning for other customer types. Right now we're doing it for commercial buildings. Why can't we do it for data centers? Why can't we do it for water district that's pumping water? There's a lot of talk about smart appliances, so that the appliance itself gets a signal, a price signal that says your dryer tells you in the heat of the afternoon, keep spinning, but turn off the heating element because it's really expensive to heat the air right now. There's a lot of activity around web or kiosk-based displays. So this is the effect that people talk about in a hybrid, where you're actually seeing your fuel efficiency in real time, and just the mere presence of that data impacts driving behavior so that you get better efficiency. Dynamic demand response. Right now, when we get called in a particular region, we turn off all of our customers. We don't have the ability, or we don't have the demand for the utility yet to say, you know what, we've got a particular pocket of trouble that we need you to address in this particular area. And it's just not an issue yet. The utility can detect outages or detect maintenance issues on the distribution grid. We can provide monitoring-based commissioning for the grid. There's a lot of talk also about a hybrid or electric vehicle that's plugged in during the day. Well, if there's a demand response event, that's actually a battery sitting there that could, in theory, pump some of that energy back onto the grid for a couple of hours if it's fully charged up. Maybe a customer actually really cares about not just the continual having power continuously, but the quality of the power. Maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more if you can use the data on the grid to help improve the quality of the power that's being delivered to them. And as we get to dynamic pricing, there's a whole flurry of services that somebody can provide to customers to help protect them from volatility, to help them not to have to think about how they're going to respond to price bumps, and to facilitate that transition. So I ran through that last little bit fairly quickly because I know we want to wrap things up and give you some time for questions. So we'll leave it at that.
Can we have time for some questions, please?
How do you align your profit incentive efficiency programs in an area where the customer is stated the decoupling policy? So the rock crusher can install equipment so that their fee is only 1,800 kilowatts. The utility finds that. That's your margin drop from 2,500 years ago to 1,800 years ago.
So the question is, how does our model work in an environment where there's decoupling, or maybe even more generally where there's already a pricing mechanism for the customer to reduce demand?
Assuming that you want efficiency to take place, not
Well, let's examine the assumptions. The The answer is, in some cases, actually, that does take the place of demand response. So we have customers in California, or we don't have customers in California, but there are customers in California who simply shut down every day from noon to 6 because they get charged a demand charge based on their consumption from noon to 6, so they don't operate. So that's not a good demand response customer. A good demand response customer is the one who can't afford to do that every day because they've got a business to run, but they can do it on occasion or can do a part of that reduction on occasion when there's a specific demand for that resource.
How frequently do events happen and how long? Like, is the customer committed to 85 hours across 10 days, or what's the...
Yeah. I hate to keep saying it varies, but it does. The typical is something on the order of, call it 4 to 5 to 6 events per year of a 4-hour duration per year. There are some parts of the country where you might go a year without it being called at all, and others where you're probably getting called more like 60, 70, 80 hours a year.
So in the Northeast, there's the Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, I think, where I know a component of that was instead of being able to produce power, you could instead produce energy savings, and I was wondering if you're a part of that?
So I don't know if this is the same issue, but I know in Connecticut, there's a white tag, like a green tag. You can get credit for your energy efficiency savings, your verifiable energy efficiency savings that can be traded and counted towards renewable generation targets. So just like you can buy a renewable energy credit, you can in Connecticut buy and sell energy efficiency credits. I don't know if that's what you're talking about, but that's definitely something we push there and continue to push around the country.
Is there any thought to tying this in with the league's building rating system to get extra points on new construction?
Yes, although actually I was trying to find an article on this morning to put it in here and couldn't find it, so I'm going to speak a little bit out of turn and maybe not get the data right. The article I was looking for was correlating energy consumption of LEED buildings following, in the months following the initial commissioning. And essentially what the article was finding is that there's absolutely a degradation in performance over time. You start out at a good level, but you don't necessarily continue to perform at that level over time, meaning our monitoring-based commissioning services are that much more appropriate. We don't tend to do anything targeted at new construction just because there's such a huge installed base out there. It's not easy there aren't as many opportunities in new construction as there are in the installed base.
What prevents people from gaming the system by turning on 4 megawatts of resistance heaters only during those peak times of the game?
Well, in most cases, what prevents them is the economics don't work out in that particular example. There are more subtle ways that you can game the system, and the market's not a perfect one. So we actually recently, just about 6 months ago, pushed for some market rule changes in the Mid-Atlantic because we felt like some people were gaming the system. So it's an evolution.
How granular are your monitoring systems, and if you're doing them in sort of a retrofit case, how invasive is the installation?
So the monitoring systems for our building commissioning, actually, we take the existing building management system, which there will typically be thousands of points in a building, and we'll pick 100 of them, or a relatively small proportion of them. Those points tend to already be there. In some cases, we do install additional points, but for the most part, the building occupants aren't aware that we have been there to start gathering the data.
Do you play off different power from different grids to each other? So, balance San Jose grid and San Diego power?
So within an interconnected grid, in theory, what we do in one area impacts the rest of the grid. In practice, there is not really a locationally focused demand response market for all intents and purposes yet.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.